Live, but we got the box in the top left. I want to say welcome if you're here. Please chat, please chime in and talk with us, right? But I'm actually here with Jason Garbis of Numberline Security. And, I think I am, right? Tell me about
I'm
yourself.
not a deep fake, Matt.
I'm not convinced yet. I'm not convinced. The garden story helped me, though. I will say the garden story definitely helped. But no, we're here seriously. I want to talk about zero trust, and anybody really quickly go to a Google search and type in Jason Garbis zero trust, and you'll know who I have here. But I really wanted to get about 40 minutes to chat with you about kind of where your background came from. What is this thing about zero trust and what are you doing now? And kind of we'll just banter into that. But Jason, let's get started by telling everybody who you are other than my introduction, I suppose.
Besides being a sometimes successful vegetable gardener fighting against the squirrels and the rabbits.
It's the scourge of the earth.
Yes, indeed, the raccoons. So I'm Jason Garbis. I'm principal and founder at Numberline Security. So this is a security consulting firm I just formed a couple of months ago to focus on helping enterprises prepare for, define, and execute on effective zero trust strategies. And I've been working in the area of zero trust for quite a while. I really started about 8 years ago or so when I joined a company that at the time was called CryptZone, a software vendor. And when I joined, we were just releasing a new network security platform that followed this open architecture from the Cloud Security Alliance called the Software Defined Perimeter. So I kind of joined that working group, the Cloud Security Alliance, and started to learn about what does this really mean? And what's happened in the 8 years since is that the industry has pretty dramatically and heavily shifted toward the concepts behind zero trust and the principles of what the original authors of the software defined perimeter, which I was not one, I can't take any credit for that.
Sure.
Really great ideas that they rolled into that have now been absorbed into this broader zero trust, the zero trust, I would say, tsunami and wave and change.
Yeah.
I've worked for software companies my entire career in a lot of different roles, starting with software engineer for almost a decade, technical consultant, and then product management for another decade or so. So this is a shift for me for sure to change to a consulting and advisory role for enterprises, but something I'm really enjoying. I really believe in zero trust as a better way toward approaching enterprise security, and it's terribly, painfully needed. So that's really my mission now, is to help enterprises effectively adopt, enroll, and implement this type of architecture and philosophy in their organization.
Well, I don't want to assume everybody understands what zero trust is. And so I don't want to do that are watching this either during this live event or as we consume it afterwards. But tell me what is the challenge with trust, right? I have some thoughts on it, but tell me what your thoughts are on what's the challenge of trust in general.
I'm not going to really be able to help you out around the human aspect of trust.
Fair, touche.
But from a network access and information security perspective, the problem with trust or implicit trust is that our systems have handicapped us or really hampered us for decades around giving too much credibility or credence or trust in network connections, remote actors, and network packets. And one of the primary reasons for that is you think about this fantastic technology that we're using on our networks, TCP/IP, which was invented in the 1970s, doesn't have a concept of security built in. And there's a really fascinating article that the Washington Post put together, a little ebook on the history of this, where they interviewed these folks who created all this technology 50, 60 years ago. And obviously, these were brilliant people. They understood security. It was not something they were able to do because they didn't have the compute capacity to run encrypted packets and to do that. They didn't have a good way of solving certificate distribution or key distribution problems.
Right.
We don't really have that today either. But anyway, our networks are designed to fantastically easily connect devices to one another. So what happens is you're on a TCP/IP network and you're advertising your services. You got open ports and you say, I'm happy to accept a connection from anyone on the planet and negotiate. And now we have a TCP connection and even a higher level application connection. And you can learn about me. You can exploit vulnerabilities before any sort of authentication happens. And that's hampered us. And you know this firsthand, Matt, from when a bad actor gets a foothold on the network, they can perform tremendous amount of network reconnaissance and lateral movement. Even if they don't have stolen credentials, they can cause a lot of damage in the network.
You now can do LLNR poisoning. You can do all kinds of things that allow you to escalate privilege, right? You have all of those things as your sweet little toolkit that you get to use. 100% accurate. Yeah.
Exactly. So zero trust is a little bit of a long backstory here, but zero trust is about removing the implicit trust around a network or device and removing the assumption that just because something is on your internal enterprise network, your so-called quote unquote trusted network, that you're going to allow that thing to have any sort of access beyond what it
Yeah.
really has earned or is allowed to access. So what that presupposes is, one, you have mechanisms for default deny access. You have enforcement points, hard enforcement points on the network to allow, device validation, identity-based authentication for either machines or for humans, and then some sort of policy model that says, okay, great, I have a level of confidence, mathematical confidence or overall confidence that this entity is who they say they are. Now I'm going to allow them, following the principle of least privilege, the minimum set of access that
Yeah.
some human being has decided they need to do their jobs.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting points to tap into that, right? Like by default, we were all about connectivity, right? From ARPANET out, it was all about just getting things hooked up. There
Right.
wasn't the focus on that protection. You started seeing walled gardens form with firewalling and methodologies for that kind of stuff, right? But really, it was enterprise would make their moat, and then once you were in the moat, you were trusted, right? And
That's
I
right.
think that speaks towards the ephemerality, unfortunately, of trust in multiple ways, whether it be a compromised machine that now is went from trusted to now a bad actor as an untrusted asset, even as a trusted asset, or as a secondary point of a compromised human, a compromised individual, a compromised set of credentials, things like that. That trust has ephemerality to it in my mind, and I think the initial models weren't built on that, right? They were built on, well, once I define it, it's defined, and we're great. Can you speak towards when you think about zero trust, how it does bring in other attributes like that are more guiding as to the decision making policy, right? Like I think that's one of the key points of SDP and even ZTNA in that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at kind of the canonical diagram around this, which comes from the NIST Zero Trust Architectures document, which is called Special Publication 800-207. So they got a great picture in there that shows in the middle the core elements of a zero trust architecture. So you have a policy decision point, you've got a
Yep.
set of policy enforcement points. But to me, what's oftentimes not highlighted enough are the boxes on the sides, which are essentially saying, I've got all these other things in my IT and security ecosystem that act as inputs into my policy decision point and my overall
Right.
contextual information. So obviously an identity system, a device management system, a SIM,
Yep.
a help desk system. Anything else that's in your environment can and should be utilized to help provide this contextual information. So something as simple as, is this device patched, right? Is my endpoint
Right.
management system confident that this device is up to a certain level, my baseline level? Okay,
Yeah.
no, yes, no, in between. Those are really important inputs into my policy model. Now I can make a much more informed decision around Matt's device is showing, let's say, yellow because it's pretty close. He hasn't updated this latest patch.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to let him do his job, but maybe I require stronger forms of authentication before he accesses
Sure.
the code. Or maybe,
Oh,
you know what? Maybe I'm not going to let him access the source code because that's my decision.
yeah, and I think that's this is the drill in I really wanted to happen. First off, Harry Cusick, good to see you, buddy. Always nice to see your beautiful
Hey, Harry.
face. But when you dig into that and you start getting into this contextualization, this stuff about the risk and this change of risk, right? Think about that vulnerability for people that are not big into security or don't understand what we're talking about here. This vulnerability of not being patched means that if Matt's sitting in a cafe or an airport lounge, as I'm one to do quite often, then as soon as somebody sees that machine and is potentially a threat actor or opportunistic threat actor, a bot, any of those models, they're able to potentially lateralize to my machine. And now that would be the same path they might ride out to my endpoint. Now, I'm obviously getting rid of some of the conversations of what an SDP tunnel and things would do for you for protection vis-a-vis that methodology. But the point is just trying to explain that you can have a situation where with vulnerabilities there and patches not being done, there might be an easy way for a threat actor to gain a foothold and further their efforts into the network. And a great example of that is if you look at LastPass or if you look at even 3CX, with both of those situations having a piece of code or a piece of platform that was expired or not up to date, and it was used handily by threat actors to pivot into the internal corporate network and take all the juicy bits, right? So that kind of is the point that you're making there, right? Is that those extra contexts might be let you say, Maybe he can't see all the juicy bits. Maybe he can only get the stuff necessary to perform his work function. Maybe he can only access the things that are not as sensitive because of this state, right? And that's what this allows you to do, is make decisions based on escalating risk, essentially. Yes.
Exactly. And to also look at activity and behavior, even things that are prevented or blocked. So you're a regular worker in a company, you're accessing certain web apps, and you're not a developer. And all of a sudden, your device starts doing maybe port scans or tries to SSH to various things. You don't even
Yeah.
know how to spell SSH, right? That's just not
Right. Yeah.
function. So that should be a red alert to any sort of monitoring system. And you should have a system that should immediately say, okay, even though they can't SSH anywhere, there's still malicious activity going on. I'm going to investigate
Exactly.
this. I'm going to quarantine this device, et cetera.
Yeah. And that gets into this point of, without that structure you've talked about, right? With a policy enforcement point, a policy decision point behind the scenes answering yes or no, right? Without that kind of structure, then machines can talk to each other, and machines aren't cordoned off and quarantined, to your point. They're able to do those things. And so are you pretty much describing an agent-based play for enforcement points at the endpoint level as well? Or are you looking at that at microsegmentation at the network level? Like, where's your heart on that?
So those are definitely both ingredients in this. And there's lots of vendors that have different architectures and there are different approaches to this. And there's clearly no one vendor, and there's no one solution that's a perfect solution for every
Sure.
situation and for every enterprise. Generally, I mean, there clearly are agentless approaches that work well for many situations. We are seeing in most cases, enterprises will deploy agents onto the desktops
For
of
sure.
most employees because you just have much better control and visibility. And
Agreed.
it tends to be a subset of users, certain user populations, maybe they're third parties, where browser-based agentless works fine. For some
Sure.
enterprises, agentless is fine for everyone. In most cases, people tend to lean toward agent-based because the benefits are worth the additional overhead here.
It's where I fall. So I didn't know that ahead of time, but that's where my heart falls on that one. And really what it comes down to is you can get so micro granular, and all of your agents become defense points, right? All of your agents, when you, let's say, have bad mat, all of a sudden, my machine's got Meterpreter on it and I'm running, right, these type of things, and you start to have bad mat, everyone else can ignore bad mat, right? Everyone else can say, no, you're not establishing that connection to this device. No, this is not okay, right? And so you have this larger shield in my mind, where even my lateralization attempts with agent-based network, in network, out network, it doesn't matter, adds an additional layer to the segmentation of the network. So I like the way you said it. Those are ingredients, because you can't just have no network segmentation or no understanding of where your assets are, no understanding of where the valuable things are. But you still have most of that moving out to the SDP layer. So maybe let's tap into that for just a sec. When you start seeing agents come into play, you now have the ability to connect devices that have no logical path to connect over a network infrastructure, correct?
That's right. That's right. What's happening is there's some sort of connection to an authentication point, and more of these identity providers are cloud-based, so they're outside your enterprise, and it becomes less of an issue. But even in the cases where it's on-prem, there's certainly mechanisms to authenticate the users, incorporate device posture checks and other context into the
Yeah.
policy decision, and then those policy decisions get communicated to the policy enforcement points, and then that device gets access to a selected, hopefully very fine-grained subset of resources. And it's a challenge for enterprises, right? MSPs, obviously, it's their job to understand what's on their customer networks and to manage that. And I would imagine that those environments tend to be better understood than a typical, I would say,
Yes.
a below average enterprise, where sometimes
Agreed.
they simply don't know. They simply don't know what's on the network.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. Yeah. When you think about that delivering of service, and let's tap back into kind of, when did you first want to coin a book? Like, when did you take this back and go, this needs to be spoken differently, right? Tell me about that a little bit.
Well, I'm dating myself, but so the Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guidebook was not actually my first book. So I wrote a book
Okay.
about this object-oriented middleware called Corba, and it was published in 1999. So I'm
Ooh,
a little bit
it was a
old.
smidge before me touching the keyboard, for sure.
But the reason I mentioned that is that I kind of knew what I was getting myself into, right? I'd written this book before with a couple of other co-authors, and I'm like, okay. So what happened was in This was in, I guess, the fall of 2019, very beginning of 2020. And I realized I'm spending a lot of time talking about zero trust, answering questions. And
Sure.
even in those cases where I had the opportunity to spend, I don't know, 2 hours with a group of people talking through this, which is a long time to spend in the meeting, there was still a lot of depth and things that I wasn't able to say and that I didn't know because some of this stuff you just takes a little bit of research. So I said, you know
Sure.
what? So I've got, I think I can and I should communicate this and put my ideas into a book. So then I reached out to my friend Jerry Chapman and convinced him to write a book. My first conversation was, he's like, "Hey, that sounds like a great idea, but I don't have time."
Yeah, yeah.
I worked on it, and we joined forces, and then really
Did you
got going.
actually author it and write it yourself, or did you hire a ghost writer? I guess maybe if you're okay to say it.
No, no, no. We wrote it ourselves.
Very cool.
Absolutely, no. I wouldn't trust a ghostwriter with this stuff.
Well, and I'm dealing with, so I just side tangent. So I'm actually writing a book with a few friends,
Mhm.
but we're doing it. I don't like to write. I am not a writer. I'm a speaker. I love to speak, and so we recorded a interview for about 4 hours. And handed it over to an editor to carve out the relative points. And I think to your call out maybe presciently, it's really challenging to get your authentic voice out after someone's taken even your video and edited it. But it's coming along. So it's about
No,
sassy. So
no, that's interesting, and I mean, I when you said ghostwriter, that was kind of like
yeah, I guess I meant more editor or more
so yeah,
someone to actually make it make sense and flow.
exactly. They're taking your
Yeah,
words, they're transcribing them, they're editing them. I mean, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
you deserve at least 90%, if not 95% credit for this, even if you
Okay,
do not
fair, fair.
type the
Then I
words
can
in.
sleep better at night. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jason. That's awesome,
yeah.
man.
And look,
That's cool.
writing can be a grind. It's
Yeah,
sometimes you'd sit there and you'd be like, oh, and you just crank at it for 3 hours, and you're like, okay, I wrote 2 pages because I had to do all this research and thinking.
sure.
Other
Well,
days
and
it's just
especially when
light.
you're doing technical writing about, real hard understood things. And so I have to imagine that gets more. Mine, I guess get the pleasure of living more theoretical. I suppose if I was describing it, this is a book much more about this one premise, and maybe I run it by you a little bit. So I talked about this, and actually, much to your journey, I am also now serving on CSA in
Hmm.
some working groups. I'm also involved in some of this stuff, much more as a consumer and regurgitator of your former work and 800 207 and other things. But ultimately, I really enjoy that, and that's a little interesting corollary. But with mine, I have this one premise, and I asked this in the working group about ZTNA: is what if we were building this and I was a startup enterprise? What if I actually didn't have all this brownfield? What if I wasn't living in a world that was created prior to all this brownfield? And I take it to like PAX 8, where I work today. They were started late in less than 10 years ago or 12 years ago, whatever it is. Maybe somebody's going to throw things at me, but certainly we were born Azure AD centric,
Right.
no AD, all using Intune as an endpoint management structure. And I have this theory of my own that the world is shifting from this very endpoint centric view of security to a very identity and where the data is centric view of security, right? And at a more holistic level. And maybe I'm just being a starry eyed child. But the thought process is, if I started with just that identity, and I had heavy validation members of that identity. I tied in very heavily with SSO. I used modern development techniques if I was going to build an application that tied into that same identity structure and extended it out. I wouldn't have the same infrastructural view of the world, and I wouldn't have near as much work to do to go zero trust by comparison. And talk me off a ledge here. Give me your thoughts on that. That's kind of the premise of this: the world being born in SaaS and shared responsibility matrices. And
Yeah,
anyways, but yeah,
in some ways that's kind of the ideal setup, is because there's no enterprise network, so you don't have to worry about
right.
lateral movement. You don't have to worry about on premises things like that. You're going to be heavily SaaS based, which is great. And
And bad in its own right, but both sides of the coin.
true, true.
Yeah,
There's different levels of controls around that.
sure.
So it depends on the nature of the business. There are some businesses who can operate, you know, essentially 100% just working with SaaS applications, and they don't have a network. Their security needs are much, much simpler. They probably want to
Yeah,
have some sort of endpoint management system, obviously, because let's say they're, I don't know, processing mortgage applications, right? You can sign up for a SaaS service to do that, but you're dealing with sensitive data. And
yep,
obviously, you have to have some sort of You want to have
There's
some.
keys to the kingdoms, there's
Yeah, exactly.
tokens, there's all kinds of things that need to be
That's right.
protected. Yeah.
That's right. Those are straightforward problems to solve by a competent security professional for sure. Once you start adding infrastructure or platform as a service, this is another layer of complexity because now you're
True.
deploying your own code, you've got source code, you've got developers, and those types of things are those platforms obviously have complexity, the major cloud service providers. So you want to make sure you understand what their identity and their access model looks like. You
Yep.
definitely want to have some sort of non-spoofable or phishing resistant MFA, whether it's a hardware token or HSM or things like that.
Preaching the choir here, man. I
Right.
got my robes on and everything. So yeah, I do a token theft demonstration that I've been doing for like 5 years, and it's just so poignant. But you throw a FIDO token, and nope, can't capture it. Sorry, I can maybe steal it somewhere and use it, but I can't capture it. So, anyways, yeah,
Yeah,
great call out.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, those things definitely reduce the attack surface and reduce the complexity of what you're dealing with because you don't have a network. You don't have to worry so much about handling network flows and logging those types of things to a SIM,
Sure.
for example. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you have some aggregation reduction. I didn't even think about that. I mean, just the seam cost perspective of what I'm grabbing now becomes more endpoint focused, becomes more on those side of things and logs and functions at the endpoint side. So, yeah, fantastic. Well, and that's kind of the theory. And I'm writing about what does that world look like for someone, right? What is the world when you're all SaaS look like? And some of the things that I actually didn't tackle in the first pass and might already have to be another volume is stuff around shared responsibility and kind of what that means in that modern world. When you're living in SaaS, and maybe we dig into that a bit. You've lived in a lot of software vendors that have created code that are code producing entities, as I would describe them. When you look at that, do you see that gap in practice in secure code development, secure code, the budget necessary to do it well, the vulnerability management, all the other things you kind of alluded to that need to exist when you're producing code? Do you see that as a gap in zero trust today?
Zero trust is much more about, I would say, the operational side of things, user access or system to system access. And it's there's a little bit of connection. There's a good connection and a way of talking about and using zero trust principles applying to a DevOps environment. But no one's really made the connection around what does zero trust mean in a secure software, DevSecOps, software supply chain, and uh, kind of that aspect of things. It's software companies, I think, are typically driven by speed and velocity, time to market, and um, I'm sure that there's places where that people cut corners or simply don't have the time to do proper security testing, to dig into what open source components they're using and what sort of vulnerabilities that might be there. And I think that's there's definitely some risks there. There's obviously some emerging regulatory compliance or standards around that, but I don't think that's a solved problem in our industry.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, I think that's also part of maybe referring to national cybersecurity strategy, some of the other things in the space that are pointing towards, hey, software developers, it's kind of your jam. You got to be responsible for this, right? You see CISA going around with secure by default, secure by design, right? You see the logos and the shifts all heading that direction. So I think you're pretty much right on the spot of it. So tell me about what you're doing these days. Help me understand the gap and the problem you're solving. You made a comment before the show that this was kind of the first time you got to be not directly in a vendor space and not directly in a software space, but help me understand it. What are you doing to solve the world today, my friend?
So, I over the decades, as I mentioned, I've worked pretty much exclusively for software vendors. And in the last 8 or so years, as I've gotten involved with the Cloud Security Alliance, I've worked myself into a leadership role at, and now one of the co-chairs of the Zero Trust Working Group there. And so in that role, which is a volunteer role, I get to spend a lot of great time talking and collaborating with people, talking to enterprises, and really helping to evangelize and promote these zero trust principles. So I've really
Sure.
enjoyed that. And I had the opportunity to make essentially a career change, and I've started this business, Numberline Security, which is focused on helping enterprises prepare for, define, and implement effective zero trust strategies and architectures to deliver both technical value as well as business value. So in that regard, now I have I have a vendor neutral hat on, and I have the opportunity to engage in lots of different conversations with different folks. And I think there's we should definitely make sure we talk about the MSP angle for this as well, because I think there's
Okay.
an opportunity there. Not,
Let's go. I'm ready right now. Let's hit it, brother. I'm in.
so let's talk about MSPs. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
so zero trust has become a big trend in the industry, and if you're a federal government employee or following this, obviously there's an executive order from the White House, and there's a
Right.
mandate
2
that
years
federal
ago. Yeah.
agencies adopt this. Enterprises, especially the larger enterprises, are paying attention to this around the world, and many of them, a large, vast majority, are embracing or starting down their zero trust journey.
Sure.
And I don't know how much that's filtered down to smaller enterprises, and I think, or smaller organizations, and right, and not necessarily, should
Yeah.
it, because
Some flavor of it, right? Some portions of it, some of the premises of it, for sure. Let's talk about the State of the Union. So I come from MSP, and by MSP, there's a lot of definitions, and most of those focus around one of two sides of a paradigm. The paradigm being either enterprise focused people will see MSP as small to mid int, doing some similar singular function for that enterprise as an outsourced source, right? That's one methodology. But the one I'm talking about is the 42% of our GDP, right? The SMB serving MSP community that CISA is finally aware of, that Congress is starting to be aware of, that we're starting to see people understand. So understand that when I'm talking about this, it's from my paradigm. That paradigm, though, is changing, and it's changing because in that paradigm, what's unique and different than enterprise serving or even mid-end serving MSPs is they expect you to be everything.
Mhm.
When you sign on as their tech person, you're the guy, you're the gal, you're the company that's handling this, right? And so they don't understand that. It's, again, there's this giant black hole of knowledge in the SMB community of they've had so long to go, that's that smart Jason guy's deal. Let him deal with it. Y'all deal with the tech. Y'all deal with the smart people stuff. And that's generally been the way SMB sees technology in my experience. So a lot of the security nascence and the understanding of security, even as a risk, has for a long time been kind of out of their camp. I mean, until you started seeing ransomware and BECs and business email compromise play out, you just didn't have a lot of risk for an SMB around tech. I mean, other than your competitor stealing your, like when there was a story here in town where the competitor gym hacked into the other gym and got their lists and, that kind of stuff, right? It's just kind of risky served, right? But not this endemic threat actor perspective. So what's interesting, I think you called it out perfectly. The MSP community and the SMB that are being served by that constituency are generally unaware. There's a giant gap. You see products like ThreatLocker, which is a application control software that's really big in the smaller space, starting to show up in Int. But their place was like a breath of fresh air. People were like, this is all of zero trust. This solves zero trust is done. They've told me everything about zero trust.
Right.
That's where they generally live today. And I think that's the transition point that's happening. You're starting to see MSPs. I'm a optimist, right? But I believe we're seeing MSPs get it. I got it by being punched in the face, right? You lose some money and get punched by Soda no Kiwi, and boy, you really start to think differently. And I still think that's the point they're at. They're still figuring out security as this thing that can be solved, not the system's broken. We need to change the way we think. So much so that I bet if you asked most MSPs, do they have a validation method of their clients when they call in? It'll be nascent or terrible, right? And if it's new, it's probably okay. But still, they don't do much validation. I can call in and destroy most MSPs by just saying, "Hi, I'm Jason Garbis. Need my password reset. Yeah, I'm on my wife's cell phone. Phone's in the drink. I lost it. It's unfortunate. Can you get me reset? I'm going to fire you if you don't." They don't even have it at that level, and so it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out and how you're seeing it. And let's just put it in regular or in functions speak. So Microsoft, if I wanted to sign into Microsoft as a MSP, I did it through the Partner Center. That Partner Center, up until GDAP, which I was part of the working group for GDAP, and still isn't even fully implemented, I had access to every client or no clients.
Mhm.
I could pay them in and have it for just a moment, but I still had this moment of risk that every single client of mine could be destroyed in a second through Microsoft Partner Center Bridge. Right.
Right.
And that only got changed just recently into having GDAP capabilities where I can have granular delegated administration. I can get into smaller subsets of that. But it's just, I think this is a capitalism problem, Jason. I don't think, yeah, anyways, I digress. I'm off
No,
my
no,
soapbox.
it's entertaining. I think, for these SMBs who really they don't understand security, right? They're relying
Sure.
on the MSP to that. Clearly, talking to them about zero trust is not going to be meaningful, and
Right.
it's gonna annoy the pig, so to speak, to mix
Sure.
metaphors here, right?
Nice.
Um, because they don't care. It's up to the MSP. And I think for the MSPs, the right way to think about this is not to go to your Sally's and Bob's flower shop and say, hey, we're going to do zero trust. It's about
Right.
we're providing best practices in security, because that's essence. If you take what zero trust is, and there's a meme about it being essentially just marketing BS.
Sure. Lots of
What
those
it's about
memes.
is building on well-proven and well-understood principles. Principle of least privilege,
Yep.
microsegmentation, multi-factor authentication,
Yep.
attribute role-based access control, and kind of extrapolating and integrating those. And for MSPs, it's a better way to operate because you get better security outcomes for your clients. It's to whatever degree you want to market yourself around that, it can be a differentiator, but it can also be an opportunity for you to take a selected vendor platform and say, okay, great, this is my plus plus version. I can charge extra for using this because it delivers more value to my customers, and I can generate more revenue for this. And by the way, deliver more value for them.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's you don't try to boil the ocean with educating every single end customer on the little things.
Right.
But if you take it back to that same thing that I see shaping out right now, if I started a company tomorrow, Jason, and I'm in an SMB, I'm probably not making code. I'm probably not doing a lot of those things. I might have some things like you have. But I got to tell you, it just landed on me. You talked about middleware in 1999. Jesus, man. Like talking about being ahead of your own self. Like, gosh. But anyway, sorry, back to the point. SMBs are not probably going to do that. If I started a company tomorrow in the SMB, I would probably start with some identity service, whether that be Okta or Microsoft or
In the
whatever it
cloud, of
may
course.
be.
In the
Google
cloud.
Cloud, of course, sure. That would probably be, if I was being honest with myself, where you'd start right now. But if you looked at that from that perspective, I would have that and some SaaS apps. And if I was smart, I would sign in with my Google or my Microsoft identity. I'd put in conditional access policies. I'd put in strong things. And then you get into a world where that's really normalized. It means every new startup is very similarly flavored, if that was the case. If you applied ZTNA or methodologies of SDP to that front end, and say you can't sign into Microsoft or Google unless you're coming from this IP or from this mutual TLS handshake, or however you end up implementing as time goes on, those principles really do take it even further down that path, to your point, right? And it'd be very simple to do for an MSP and very, very scalable for that SMB as that gets normalized. Where it gets harder, or go ahead. No, you look like you
Yeah,
had
no,
something to
no,
say.
which is absolutely right. And when you're relying on SaaS applications, there's kind of a different set of capabilities and different approach. And you worry a lot less about network and more about the endpoint and the data, which is great. It elevates the conversation. It takes a whole set of things off your plate and reduces the headaches there. And I think depending on the type of business, you could get away with cloud-based identity, some sort of endpoint management system, and just cloud-based SaaS applications.
Sure.
If that's your business and that works for you, fantastic. You've got a nice, simple world. You don't have an enterprise network. If you're building your own code and deploying that, then you're working with one of the major cloud providers. You do an infrastructure or platform as a service. Then you've got developers and your DevOps and your SREs who have
Sure.
privileged access. And then that feels at least 50% closer to traditional privileged access, traditional network access.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden you do have a network. It's just running in the cloud environment, and you have
Right.
to solve those
And
problems again.
and similarly so if you're hosting an application in the same way, right? If you're now taking an IaaS approach for an application, even if it's bolted into your identity, right? With Microsoft, you have Azure AD that can bolt in with AADDFS, which is now a left-hand, right-hand replica of that cloud identity to a kind of on-premise simulator
Right.
for AD. And so you can bind application servers to that, SQL
Mhm.
servers, you could use services, but the same breadth applies. You now still have to extend that zero trust principle to a harder, more complex space that's still more repeatable with cloud services. Like if I'm using IaaS somewhere, Google Compute or Microsoft or whoever, but it now is something that still has to be a new lens you're having to focus on as that security professional
Right.
helping with those clients. And so
That's
it's a
right.
great call out.
And you have traditional, operating system patching and upgrades and things like that. I think
All the things.
the
Yeah.
benefits of working in a cloud environment is 100% API driven. You can instrument this stuff. It's all automatable. So you can just,
Yeah.
you can have a whole DevOps infrastructure where you destroy something, you spin up new instances, it's immutable. Whatever
Yep.
approach you want to take, it's a much richer and better environment than, okay, I've got 100 servers in the data center,
Yep.
physical Dell servers.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not always cheaper, I would say, for sure. but it's definitely gives you more robust capabilities, faster, more flexible. Even when I talk about those code producing entities, as you kind of speak towards and kind of probably spend a lot of time with, those companies are more empowered to be able to be templatized by somebody like you to say, I know what success looks like. I can paint success for you. Right? Is that a component of the cloud side too, the normalization aspect of it? Or does it get more complex at enterprise and I'm just being childlike?
It's no, there's definitely, I would say, design patterns and templates that can and should be defined here. And I think it's really early days. It's you touched on that, and it's interesting because it's something that we talked about in the working group and been thinking about of how do we explain that? How do we give these organizations reference architectures and things like that? If you look at
Yeah.
the work that NIST is doing as part of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, they have this big giant project going on, which is tremendously complex, but it'll be tremendously
As it
valuable.
always is with them. Yes.
But
Oh
I
my
think there's
gosh.
an opportunity to, to have the right people create these reference architecture or templates to help organizations say, okay, I kind of look like this, and this is what I can take
Sure.
from this.
Yeah, as like you say, reference is perfect. We do have a comment. It's going to take me a second to read it, but I'll do it. So Mason says, "I'm working for an MSP. I ran into a security hurdle while trying to get a client to reach CMMC compliance in 800-171. Obviously, asked a lot of people internally for experience to share, but no one had any knowledge. It seems like we're working on building out security and compliance resources for future situations. So, very correct that MSPs are just starting out on understanding what ZT or zero trust really means when supporting small to medium clients." Lot to unpack there, but ultimately, Mason, I agree. It's just new, and it's newly being enforced further down the supply chain, and it's being driven down. I mean, Jason, I was in a city that was very big on making airplane and weapons and missile parts, very large manufacturing, and I got dragged into 800-171 in like 2016 or
Mhm,
so,
mhm.
2017, early days, and you had a couple of camps. You had people that would just abjectly lie and not even want to dig into it and understand and unpack it. Like they literally would just check yes on the 800-171 box, right? All the way up till the interim decision that started the Spurs score. But you see that, and then on the other side of the camp, I had the guy leaning in. He had advisors he had hired. They're brilliant, and they're like, I just looked at your MSP, and you will never meet this. You are blown away. You can never meet this. And you see this 5-6 years later. Now we're still hammering out this, and that goes back to kind of that NIST and then government involvement and things and the complexities that come from it. But great call out, Mason. Jason, when painting that picture, have you been involved much with the MSP community serving this SMB, or is that fairly well been outside of your expertise box for today?
Yeah, I've had a few conversations with MSPs, not enough, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to kind of as a community
Sure.
find what does zero trust look like in that world? How can MSPs use this to deliver better value and to grow revenue
Yeah.
in their world?
And I like the pragmatism. You're really just defining zero trust as an amalgamation of all the things we should be doing anyway, right?
Yes,
Principle, least
well,
privilege,
yes and
or help
no.
me. Okay.
Yeah, yes and no, right? So it's I love having this conversation with a skeptic, right? Because zero trust is not about throwing, I won't say anything. It's not about throwing away all the good work that's been done by the industry. It's definitely
Right.
standing on the shoulders of giants and taking the things that we know that work and building on them and integrating and throwing away a few things, right? For goodness sake, let's turn off our VPNs and move to something better. Let's
Yeah.
probably reconsider coarse-grained NAC-based VLAN segmentation and move to a more micro-segmentation model. But what's new about zero trust is it, number one, default deny on the network. Number two,
Yeah.
ensure that you have a contextual and event-driven policy model that's dynamic so that when an entity, human or non-human, is authenticated to your satisfaction, they're given precise access control, and that you have access to this rich set of contextual information about the device and the network and the application, and you have a mechanism for handling events such as alerts or alarms or things like that. And there is a risk of, this is a journey. You don't want to start with, okay, on the first month I deploy this, I'm going to hook it up to my SIM and my service
Right.
desk, and it's going to be very dynamic because that's way too much to digest at first. So it's about starting small and building on it from there and choosing selectively where and how much complexity and sophistication to add, because you don't want to overdo it.
Yeah. And especially when you start thinking about, Alyssa Miller, I'm sure maybe you've run across her, but she talks about how we're told so long in security that the language of business is risk. And she says, that's wrong. Language of business is profit. Risk is a secondary function, right? Like that's an aspect of that. And so I think to your point, you don't want to over complexify. You don't want to make, I don't think that's a word, but it's okay. You don't want to make it so hard and so aspirational that you don't ever succeed. But you got to start and you have to batten it down little by little, right? It's how you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time.
Yeah,
Is that kind of the point?
that's part of it. And the other part is that, and this is some work that we're doing with the Cloud Security Alliance right now, is we're authoring a paper on the communicating the business value of zero trust, is
Nice.
really understanding and tying or connecting these security initiatives to a business initiative. Or really the right way to think about it is, what's important to my business? Is it the obvious stuff like cost savings, or are there business initiatives that I can tie into, like, hey, the business is taking these applications and moving them to the cloud, or
Yeah.
business needs to open up in this new market that's geographically remote, and this has networking implications, et cetera, access implications,
Yep.
to make sure that to enable the business to do these things in a secure and more agile way is the right way to tie zero trust into these, to tie a zero trust initiative to a strategic business initiative, so that you're not pushing a rock uphill and
Right.
rolling out, hey, everyone, this is the next generation VPN. Don't you love it? No, most
Yeah.
people don't love it, and they don't care. They have other
Yeah.
jobs to do, versus this is going to help you do your job better, Mr. or Ms. CFO,
Right.
manufacturing, general manager, whatever it is. Then they get excited.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I heard a speaking engagement. It was last year at September. There's a little CISO private invite that we went to, and Starbucks CEO, I think it was Andrew Kirkland at the time, was talking about how he got people to do FIDO tokens for the baristas, right? And he was saying, I didn't win that on the security benefits, on the fact that it's phishing resistant. Nobody cared about any of that. You know what they cared about? And I bet you're already smiling because you know the answer.
No, I don't. I don't.
When that barista walks up to serve coffee and sign into the thing for the first time, she's securely signed in faster by about 16 seconds than when you're signing in with any other method without any other failure. And therefore, I can project that we could sell more coffee as a result by 15, right? Like, and I'm being a little hyperbolous, and so is he. But the point was, he took it to a business function. He took it to a, hey, you want to serve your customers fast? That's one of the things you talk about. Here's how we can shave some time off of that and increase security. Let's do this, right? Like, and it's interesting the way you've had to do it. And I bet you could tell a bunch of stories on those conversations with executives and companies of how you tie it to a value prop. And I think they'd be wildly beneficial to others. But maybe we save that for another time. Any closing thoughts? I mean, thankful for you being here. This is awesome. I'm a virtual nobody, and it's just super awesome to have a thought leader like you to be able to help me hone my own thoughts. But anything to close us out?
Well, thanks, Matt. This has been a great conversation. I enjoy talking about this stuff, and I really enjoy our back and forth. You bring a great perspective here as well. Yeah, I would encourage folks to take a look at. There's tons of information available about zero trust, whether it comes from NIST or CISA. I've authored 2 books on this that are available on Amazon, or from the publisher, or directly from my website. And make sure you understand it and definitely take it as a journey, and think about the right way to roll this out to your customers, especially if they're smaller or medium businesses. And I was laughing in your Starbucks story, because I often, when I'm talking to security professionals, I say, look, it may break your heart, but your business people don't care about security.
It's a true story. You're telling them the truth, brother.
So it's, to really tie it to delivering better value, delivering better reliability, and yes, better security, because that's what they rely on you for. But really tying it to helping them do their jobs and run their businesses better is the right way to approach this.
Means you have to know the business, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And some people have a really negative reaction to the actual term zero trust. They're like, what? You don't trust me? Well, bugger off.
I don't trust me. I don't even trust me in a zero trust. Well, that's awesome. It was great to get to meet you. I've seen your work. In fact, you may have books you've actually written. I right now officially have an editorial credit on the CSA module 4 for zero trust. If you look way down the page, there's a comma in the 3rd paragraph that I officially added to that document. So I do have editor's credits. It was a comma and a space. It was Oxford, but no, I tease. Thanks for everybody being here. And if you're catching this afterwards, how can they reach out to you, Jason, if you're looking for a consultant or a company to help you down that journey?
So they can find me on LinkedIn, or reach me on numberlinesecurity.com.
Awesome, brother. Thanks for having you. Appreciate
All
you,
right.
man.